Affairs Council of Maine audience, but also everyone who's tuning into this program on C-SPAN. They are covering this on their C-SPAN 1 channel. And this is Susannah George, until very recently was the Washington Post bureau chief based in Dubai. She's just transitioned back to the United States. She'll be doing a stint in Washington. But while she was in the Gulf, she covered the politics, the cultural, social life, the dynamics of life, Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, Qatar, and Oman. She was also the Post bureau chief in Afghanistan and is known for her really nuanced reporting that gives voice and perspective to people and voices that are often overlooked in international coverage. Susannah, you were also the first Post reporter to come to be invited back to Iran to actually report from Tehran on, what is it, May 24th, right about 3 weeks before the strikes. What was that like being there at that time?
Yeah, it was an incredible experience. All of the places that I had worked all over the world, I never thought that I would have the opportunity to report from inside Iran, a country that has really been at the center of a lot of the different coverage that I've been a part of. It's so critical to a lot of U.S. policy in the Middle East and the region. So when we were invited to Iran, it was to attend a conference, which in and of itself was a pretty fantastic, a pretty out of the ordinary invite to receive. And at that conference, Iran was really trying to put forward the message that the country was ready to engage. The talks with the US over the nuclear program were in full swing. They had just had a positive round of talks. Another round of talks was going to be just a few days after our trip to Iran. And so all of the foreign policy elites were at this conference talking to journalists in the hallways. There were panel discussions on the main stage, people giving briefings over lunch. It was really a dramatic change for a country that, as a journalist, often feels like a bit of a black box to cover, that you're kind of, trying to read the news and listening to public speeches that officials are giving and trying to kind of figure out what's actually going on behind the scenes. So to see all of this messaging out in the open, this kind of attempt at giving the impression that there was a lot of transparency and engagement was really interesting, especially at this time where people had a lot of high hopes for the diplomatic element of the US-Iran talks.
Now, when you say people have high hopes, are you talking generally? Are you talking primarily about regime officials, the people that you interacted with in those elite circles, or were you able to catch a sense that optimism was shared among regular people going about their daily lives in Iran's capital?
Yeah, I'll say that the people who I was able to speak to, and after the conference, we were able to go out into Tehran, go to markets, restaurants, parks, public parks, speak to people there. There was a cautious hope at that time, this was in May, that there could be some kind of a deal reached. And part of that was because that that the Supreme Leader had finally greenlit engaging with the US in an open way. That was seen as a really positive sign. The other positive sign, and this one surprised me, was that Iranians saw the election of Trump to the presidency in the US as a positive for the hopes of getting a deal. They saw him as a very strong president that he liked to get deals and he liked to kind of succeed and solve conflicts through diplomacy. And they saw him as someone that if he wanted this deal badly enough and he was able to find a deal that suited his purposes, that he would then be able to kind of push that through Congress in a way that they thought Biden wouldn't have had the political capital to. And I'm telling you that this was the readout I was getting from Iranian officials, but also just people who I spoke to in the parks. It's a very engaged a country that's very engaged with the news, and And so people were very hopeful, but also really were struggling. You know, Iran has been under very tight punishing sanctions for many years now. And people said that, you know, after all this time, that it was almost like not that they felt that they were at a breaking point, but there was definitely this feeling that whatever the status quo is now, sure, it's kind of working now, but it's not going to last into the next generation. So people felt like all of these factors were coming together and really kind of creating the space for a breakthrough.
That's really interesting because I've heard this reaction to Trump from leaders and from people across the region weighing in and saying, you know, they thought Trump as a strong leader would be able to shake things up. He would be able to negotiate a deal, bring things together. And I find that a little ironic because this was exactly the same time that he had issued his famous ultimatum and said, you know, come up with a deal or else. And my understanding is at that time, you know, tensions were really rising, the talks were almost deadlocked. Did you get any sense at that time, or was there anything in hindsight where you're like, oh, okay, I could see that we were headed for a bit of an impasse?
Yeah, so all of that kind of hope and positive signs that I was talking about, that was all there on the surface, especially on the surface when it came to the government officials who we were able to speak to. Once you started talking to people about the details of what was being discussed in these meetings with the US negotiating team, what it is that Iran wanted to even see out of an agreement with the United States, you got to see pretty early on that this issue of enrichment was a huge issue. And the two sides that, even though they had had multiple rounds of talks by that point, and they had, you know, even a few more rounds of talks before the outbreak of war in Iran, that the two sides, even though they were continuing to meet and they were continuing to say they had productive meetings, they weren't coming any closer together on this key issue of enrichment. This was so at the time that I was in Iran, it was when people were thinking, okay, all we need is some sort of a creative solution to solve this enrichment issue. Maybe part of the enrichment process will happen outside of Iran, and part of it will be able to happen inside Iran, and the material will be moved from one country to another. I mean, people were trying to come up with all different kinds of solutions for this, but none of them, they would be floated and they just weren't entertained at all by one side or the other. And so they really just weren't making progress. And one of the messages that I got from Iranian officials loud and clear in Tehran was that the country's nuclear program is a huge point of pride. It's not something that they're going to give up easily. It's not something they're going to give up willingly. And it's not something they can. That they've the way that it was described to me is this is a program that the Iranian country has sacrificed. This is the way that the regime sees it. They've sacrificed a lot for it. You know, they've endured a lot of attacks. You know, their nuclear scientists were killed even before the Israeli attacks. They had suffered a lot of attacks on their nuclear scientists. And so they weren't going, this wasn't something that even, you know, after a little bit of strong arming that they were going to relent on, that it was something that they were really going to hold firm on.
So it sounds like they were really just, you know, waiting or hoping that they would get to some sort of a way that they could thread that needle or kind of paper over the differences. Is that correct? I mean,
Yeah, that
go ahead, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the hope that the desire for a deal, that the desire to avert a war, that you know the desire to go the diplomatic route rather than the military route, that that was going to prevail eventually, and that you know someone somewhere um, would uh, would decide that you know maybe like they would be able to kind of kick the enrichment issue down the road in a way that you know some people saw the Obama era deal of doing.
So it really sounds like they talks, you know, they were understanding that the talks are going to be difficult and that they might come to an impasse. And, you know, I guess I'm asking you to sort of, you know, play soothsayer a little bit here, but do you think they were expecting that the talks would break down and move so quickly to this military engagement that you saw? Was this totally unexpected? I mean, the negotiations ultimately collapsed. Do you think that the fact that there were strikes took the regime by surprise?
I mean, it did. I mean, even just going through these events leading up to those of the Israeli attacks on Iran in June. I mean, it shouldn't have been as surprising as it was, but yet it was. I mean, we know that it was surprising because so many senior Iranian officials were in their homes when the attacks occurred. If there had been any inkling that they were coming, those officials would have been, safely in a bunker somewhere. But I think that when you're kind of looking at the months and weeks in the lead up to the Israeli strikes on Iran, there was a lot happening diplomatically, but actually the kind of push from the Israeli side toward military action was really more based on the military victories that Israel had achieved against Iran and its allies in the region in the year leading up to the large scale Israeli attacks on Iran, taking out Hezbollah, Iran launching attacks on Israel that were largely ineffective. Before that, Israel had been very fearful of what an Iranian attack might be able to inflict on Israeli territory. And then Israel taking out Iran's air defenses in the fall of 2024.
Yeah.
That was something that, after that, a lot of people said, wow, like Iran has been left wide open for an Israeli attack. And I remember thinking that that was a bit of an exaggeration. But all of these things together, they really kind of created an opportunity for Israel that wasn't going to remain an opportunity for a long time. And I think that that was really one of the most important kind of push factors towards Israeli engagement against Iran.
Yeah, I mean, we in our first webinar, we talked a lot in this series. We talked a lot about how much the regional calculus has changed. Essentially, Hezbollah's offline, Syria's is changed hands completely. The whole Shia crescent has kind of been smashed wide open. Um, but I think now we're still hearing that the only in our second conversation, our speakers talked a lot about how the only real way out of this is an actual negotiated deal that deals with Iran's nuclear program once and for all and comes to some sort of accommodation on sanctions. And absent that deal, we're really in for a long haul in the region. So now that you're back in Washington and kind of getting your bearings and hearing the conversations here while remembering what you learned and what you observed while you were there, what conditions do you think could prompt the talks to resume again? What would the Iranians need to have enough trust to actually re-engage? And would this current administration be willing to make some of those gestures or offer some of those concessions?
I mean, the word you said, trust. I mean, that is the key word. And the trust was not there even when they were engaging with Trump earlier this year before the war. So, I mean, the trust is beyond gone at this moment. And I think that unfortunately that is the most important element. I cannot I know that from the Trump administration side, of course, they're willing to, engage with Iran again. From the Iranian side, I cannot imagine how the Iranian side would justify engaging with the U.S. again. I mean, it was a pretty serious decision-making process that the Supreme Leader went through before greenlighting engaging with the U.S. I know there was a lot made about indirect versus direct talks, but the fact that the Supreme Leader was willing to engage at all was a big deal, for lack of a better expression. And the and the Supreme Leader, while he does have the final say on a lot of issues in Iran, he is expending political capital at times when he's making these kinds of decisions. And that was not a cheap decision when it came to political capital. So I don't think that we can expect him to greenlight talks with the US again, especially, talks that will, in these negotiations, Iran is being asked to make some pretty serious concessions, on top of engaging with the US. Like the engagement itself is seen as a concession by a lot of Iranian officials and definitely by the Supreme Leader. And so from the point of view of an Iranian politician or from the supreme leader, like how could you possibly justify making concessions in a diplomatic framework if you know that you could just be attacked by Israel, from the Iranian perspective, kind of out of nowhere. There was no, it wasn't that wasn't a war that Iran feels like it instigated in any way. So unfortunately, I don't see a lot of prospect there, but I do think just in terms of where the diplomatic path could go from here, I think looking at the UN General Assembly next month, I think will be an interesting indicator of kind of where Iran's head is at diplomatically in terms of its engagement with the outside world. You know, Pezeshkian, Iran's president, his speech at UNGA last year was really kind of set the tone for Iran's desire to engage with the US and with the West. It's crazy to think that that was just a year ago. A lot has happened in the last year. So seeing what he says this year, if he comes with a large delegation, those kinds of things, I feel like they could give you a good idea of kind of what we can expect out of the next few months.
And we will definitely stay tuned to that. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the Gulf. The leaders of the Arab Gulf states, they obviously have a tense relationship with Iran. There are regional rivalries between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and growing concern over Iran's rising power in the region, its proxy militias. How did the leaders of these states react? Were they more concerned about the airstrikes or the fact that there were talks that might actually lead to another Iran deal? What was more anxiety provoking for them?
One interesting part of this story is how much the Iran Gulf dynamic has changed in the last, 4, 8 years. The first time there was an Iran deal under the Obama administration, the Gulf did not want that deal. The Gulf was kind of pushing the US to go to engage militarily with Iran. Now, this time, fast forward to the last few months, the Gulf was the one of the strongest voices in Trump's ear, telling him, do not green light an Israeli attack on Iran. So that just shows you how much has changed. And the big driver of that change is that and the Gulf has begun engaging diplomatically with Iran themselves. There's been a flurry of diplomatic activity in the wake of the October 7th attacks in an effort to kind of try to contain the violence that's really been spreading across the region, and a concern that if that violence were to begin to touch, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, that it could really do some serious damage to the economic plans that those countries have for their future, kind of moving away from their reliance on oil. So part of this change is fueled by the Gulf's deciding to change the way they interact with Iran, but also, at the same time that that has been happening, Israel has been conducting these military strikes against Iran and Iranian interests that have also made Iran less of a military threat to the Gulf. And so these leaders, they are engaging more with Iran, and also they don't feel like they need to engage in convenient alliances that would just act as a kind of a semi-security pact against Iran. So it's really just changed a lot of the dynamics across the region.
So obviously, the changing in the regional balance of power is a factor in this, but do you think there's been a change, or do you think these strikes have changed the Gulf leaders' perception of the reliability of the United States as an ally?
I I I know that there was a lot when the US when Israel first started striking Iran, and there was some chatter about the United States might join the effort. The mood in the Gulf was panic. I was in Dubai when that happened, and there was a lot of concern, more concern than I had ever seen. And this is, a part of the world where its leadership is famously very cool, and doesn't panic. It was the most panic I had seen, and I had been in Dubai I'd begun my time in Dubai a month before the October 7 attacks. So there had been a lot of ups and downs, but this was definitely the most concerned people had been. And the reason why is because the feeling is that with military intervention, and this is concerns that are linked to the US intervention in Iraq, that still looms very large in a lot of people's minds in the region, that there are unintended consequences that you can't plan for, and that those unintended consequences aren't bad for business, and they're not good for economic development. And so what people and then, and then we saw that after the U.S. Struck Iran, Iran retaliated by striking a U.S. military base in Qatar. And I know that I'm guessing that probably didn't get a lot of attention in the news in the United States. That was a huge deal. It was a really big deal. There weren't people injured. There weren't a lot of injuries. There wasn't a lot of damage done. But this kind of an attack, I mean, it just takes one errant missile falling in the wrong place that could really just completely change the way the whole region interacts with each other. So I don't think that there's a lot of love for the United States and definitely for the Trump administration in the Gulf. I don't think there's been any change in that, but there's, I think, even more trepidation about using military force to solve some of these disputes. So I think more support for going the diplomatic route in the future.
So, speaking of the diplomatic route and this sense of trepidation, all of a sudden, oh my God, the US is going to use force. We've seen over the last year, but even before that, some of the Gulf states stepping up into a very prominent mediation role. So you have Oman, who's been brokering back channel talks between the US and Iran since John Kerry was around. And over the last year, Qatar has been taking a lead in terms of the negotiations with Hamas. And before that, the Taliban. You're also seeing Saudi Arabia and the UAE step up to a certain extent. Are we kind of on the cusp of a real change in how conflicts are managed and settled in the Middle East as a whole, where it's going to be the Gulf states leading the charge as opposed to the United States, or is the United States still seen as the arbiter of last resort?
The US is definitely, I mean, if the US is definitely seen as the preferred primary ally for sure. I mean, you saw that on full display when Trump visited the Gulf, was, greeted with great pageantry in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. It's I don't think that you're going to see any dramatic change there. And we've seen this alliance survive, through a lot of ups and downs, and through the Israeli war against Hamas in Gaza. And that was been a really significant strain on the US's alliances with all of its Arab allies, and definitely the Gulf as well. And the fact that it survived through that, I think, is definitely a testament to its staying power into the future.
That's another thing we hear a lot in the coverage in the United States. Before October 7th, there was this notion out there that the Palestine question had kind of been forgotten. The Gulf states had moved on, and that it wasn't just Palestine wasn't important anymore. Now we're kind of being hearing that the leaders of the Gulf states, it's kind of a distraction. Um, how is this conflict impacting the leaders and also the population? I mean, what were you experiencing in terms of how citizens in the Gulf were seeing this conflict going on in Gaza and evaluating their leaders' foreign policy as a result?
Yeah, I mean, One of the things I was struck by the most was how similarly young people and, young, when I say use young people broadly, people, young families, how they, in the Gulf, people who are from the region, how they viewed what was happening in Gaza is very similar to what I was hearing from a lot of young Americans, young families in the United States, just complete horror that this was something that could happen at this time in our collective history, and that it was something that could happen kind of, with it within the sight of the whole world, that you could be kind of bombarded with these daily images that were just kind of unimaginable. That there are people in this world that not that far away that are living through this type of war. It's not just war, it's the way that the war is being waged, I think, that particularly horrifies people. And I think that there was an assumption at the beginning of the Israeli war against Hamas and Gaza that kind of anger at the war would dissipate. I mean, it never broke out in the form of protests or something like that, because that doesn't happen in the Gulf Arab states. But that people are, it never really kind of disappeared entirely from the public discourse either. This is something that people are still very upset about. There were some boycotts of American brands or brands that were seen to have too close of an association with Israel. And a lot of those boycotts are still ongoing. We had seen there were some revenue numbers from some of those brands that showed that even a year in after the October 7 attacks, that the revenues were down. And so while for the leaders of these countries, there's probably larger, more pressing foreign policy priorities. I think there's also an understanding that this is something that while the Palestinian issue might not have been one that energized people before October 7 changed all of that. And now it's an issue that's really going to have to be considered, as countries make decisions into the future.
Do you think it's taken normalization off the table for Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries that have yet to join the Abraham Accords? I mean, Trump is talking about expanding it tomorrow. Or do you think that there's a grand deal afoot?
Yeah, I've also heard about possible expansion of the Abraham Accords. I don't know if you could say that Gaza itself took normalization. I mean, it definitely delayed Saudi Arabia's decision about normalization. And then there were a lot of other things that happened after October 7 that kind of made normalization less appealing to Saudi Arabia. I feel like the economic incentives element of normalization kind of lost a little bit of its luster. We saw a huge tech boom that's not reliance on Israel. Israel's economy has really suffered, since the war in Gaza. That's kind of made it a little bit less appealing. What we were talking about earlier with Iran's changing position in the region, that's made normalization feel a little less urgent. A lot of the Abraham Accords was. A lot of the appeal of the Abraham Accords was as a security pact against Iran. But I think that the way that the Trump administration is thinking about expanding the Abraham Accords now is not necessarily getting like the big Saudi, like the big deal with Saudi Arabia, but maybe adding a few other smaller countries to the accords that they have now. I feel like that could be the more likely path forward for that.
In thinking about the Abraham Accords, um, the big deal here was that it was going to open up this economic relationship, and there was going to be trade and there was going to be exchange. I'm wondering if you've observed whether or not Israel is actually, despite having these normalization accords, Israel is more isolated regionally than before. I mean, were you no longer seeing Israelis in Dubai? Were they still coming? Were they changing? how they were, being seen, being more cautious? Were there deals still being made? What was the impact there?
The video froze a little bit, but I'll just start answering your question.
Great.
Uh, the effect of normalization in Dubai, I mean, after October 7, you still saw there were still flights between Israel and the UAE. I mean, they stopped for a little while due to security concerns around Ben Gurion Airport when rocket fire was a daily occurrence from Gaza, but they resumed pretty quickly after that. I spoke to some Israeli business owners in the UAE. They said they were able to continue working, but they made some small changes. They just were a little bit less kind of front and center with saying that they were an Israeli business. It was mostly kind of making some changes on like branding and signage. And that was mostly the businesses doing that out of an abundance of sensitivity to, their clients. Most of the people that they interact with doing business in Dubai are Arab. And so, I mean, I think, but the thing is, what you hear from a lot of people is that's the way that the UAE and Israel had always done business. These are two countries that have had business ties for years, that are very, very strong. And that before normalization, everything, was there, but it was just, a little bit kind of under the radar. People, this is interesting. One of the people, an Israeli businessman who I spoke to in Dubai, he said in some ways he felt more comfortable being a Jewish person in the UAE than he did in some European countries. And so, even though like these people were kind of keeping a slightly lower profile, there was an incident with a rabbi being abducted in the UAE. I think in general, people felt like they had the support of the Emirati government, and they felt very confident with that. I will say that I was also speaking to business owners who maybe used to do business more with Israeli businesses. They said that Emirati businesses or other Arab businesses in the region, they said that they had come under a lot of pressure to cut those ties. And so while that might not have been, manifesting in kind of a hostile way, they did feel like because of their, relationship to their customers or maybe other people on their board, they couldn't kind of maintain as many business ties with Israeli businesses as they used to. So, I mean, there's all of this is anecdotal, but in many ways, the kind of business ties that existed before October 7th definitely endure, but kind of building on that, expanding that is something that we just haven't seen because of all of this conflict in the region.
That's so interesting, and I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry with all the tech challenges we're having this evening. That's not the first time I've heard myself from Israeli Jews, particularly those of Sephardi origin, that they feel more comfortable in some of the Arab countries, particularly in Dubai, than Europe or the United States, which is really interesting. I want to thank you for this amazing conversation. I want to turn now to some of the great questions we have from our audience. I want to start with a question from Ambassador David Pierce, who was a reporter in Beirut before he began his distinguished career with the U.S. Foreign Service. And he's asking, what was it like to apply for a visa as a U.S. journalist via the Iranian consulate? How long did it take? What period of stay? What was
I
the
love
process
the
like?
technical question from a fellow or former journalist. I like that.
I
All of
thought
my
you would.
journalist friends, that's the first question they had for me. That's funny. So because I was invited to attend this conference, the application process was not your normal process. The visa was pretty much guaranteed from the moment I applied. But I will tell you a funny story. I had to, or I thought I had, I didn't know that it's an electronic visa. You don't even get your passport stamped anymore. Um, I thought that I had to go to the consulate in Dubai to pick up the physical visa. Normally you go and you hand in your passport. So I go and there's, security check at the front door and the guy sees my American passport and he's like, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" I was like, "Yeah." So then I went in, they were like, "No, it's an e-visa. You just need to print out the QR code." And I was like, "Okay." So that was the very kind of harrowing story of my visa application.
That's amazing. I think it's also, defies a lot of preconceived stereotypes. You've got this high-tech QR code visa.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to invite everyone to put their questions in the question and answer box if you haven't already. I have a question here on the European angle to all of this, wondering how the recognition of Palestine by the UK, France, Australia, Canada, or the threat to recognize Palestine, is there any impact on the situation between Israel, Iran, and the United States? Does Europe, and also building on that, does Europe possibly have a role to play here?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that would play into it, but what does have an impact on the US's interaction, with lots of different countries in the region is this growing frustration with the way that the Israeli war in Gaza is being waged. We've seen that from, within the Republican Party kind of anger over the humanitarian situation in Gaza, especially as the starvation crisis in Gaza has become more acute. You've seen that, and I think that the talk of recognition of Palestine by those European countries has been in part kind of fueled by this frustration with the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So I do think that all of that does put pressure on the US to maybe then put pressure on Israel to adjust the way that it's waging the war. I don't know if that necessarily would translate into a change in the US Iran dynamic, but it could create a bit more space for diplomacy for sure.
That's interesting. Question here on a couple of our guests are segueing back to Iran. The perennial question, the president has said that the nuclear program was completely obliterated. Others have said, the program was only set back by a month. The question here is, how long do you think it could take Iran to build their enrichment program back? And did you, glean any information while you were there on how badly they were hit and how badly those sites were impacted?
Yeah, this is, it's such an important question. And I think most people really just don't have a good answer for that. And part of it is, obviously assessing the damage done by the strikes from afar is incredibly complex and, and has its own, their own issues with that. But also, there was a lot, even when the IAEA was visiting Iran's nuclear sites regularly, and there was cameras up and there was inspectors, there was a lot we didn't know about Iran's nuclear program. And that there was a lot of change, and we can imagine that there were probably a lot of things moved around and changes in the first few days of the Israeli attacks on Iran before the U.S. then struck those primary enrichment facilities. And so, the fact that we don't even really know what material was in what place when the U.S. strikes hit, I think makes it very hard to tell how much damage was sustained. So unfortunately, that's my very kind of bad answer that I just don't know. But I think that things like this will learn more, as Iran's already had time to kind of assess the damage themselves. And then as Iran starts to kind of rebuild its program, I think that's when we're going to start to see kind of information trickle out, either Iran bragging about, the program is back to this level, and then people be able to kind of see whether or not the reality matches the public statements. But I think that's when we'll start to be able to kind of piece together a more full picture of that.
One thing that didn't get very much coverage here, and I wonder if it was covered more, if there were stronger reactions in the region, was the fact that in the Israeli strikes, they took out or basically assassinated so many of Iran's
Mhm.
nuclear scientists. How big a factor do you think that is, both in terms of like actual capacity, but also psychologically?
Yeah, that huge. I mean, it's that is a because when I visited Iran, it was before the Israeli attacks, and that was talking about the nuclear scientists who had been killed by Israel. This was before the Israeli direct kind of large scale war against Iran. Um, that that this was a huge it was something that kind of lived very large and at the forefront of people's thoughts about, Iran's position in the region, and when people talked about the sacrifices that Iran had made for its nuclear program, the deaths of just, a few nuclear scientists before so many more were killed during the Israeli attacks. That was something that, people talked about a lot. So this is a huge deal for Iran. What some people who I'd spoken to who had more knowledge of Iran's nuclear program, they said that, this is not something where if you are able to assassinate a few nuclear scientists, that you're going to do serious irreparable damage to Iran's nuclear program. But just like attacking an enrichment facility, just like, damaging, other parts of Iran's nuclear program, killing nuclear scientists is definitely sets the entire program back and makes it that much more difficult for Iran to rebuild.
One of the questions here built a little bit on this. We haven't gotten into the regime and the public's attitude toward the regime. Of course, before all going back before October 7th, there was the Woman Life Freedom protests. Um, do these strikes, the killing of scientists, killing of leaders, is it having this rally around the
Yeah.
flag effect, or are there still these deep fissures between the population and the regime? I mean, are people still, women still coming without hijab? Are there still hints of protest? Were you able to observe anything there or get any reports about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think those two things you're talking about, I think they both happened. I think there was both a rally around the flag, or someone who I spoke to said he liked to describe it as like a national solidarity. Like it was more of like a community, if I can put it in this smaller terms. It was more like a community kind of coming together. We're all in this together sense, rather than a huge outpouring of necessarily strong nationalism, but also a lot of frustration. Why some people who I spoke to said, why is this happening to us? All for, some people say, like, all for this nuclear program that we do not care about. Like, this nuclear program has brought us nothing but, sorrow. And so I think both of those things happened at the same time. I know that, again, my reporting was before this war happened, but I know that people who I spoke to who were supportive of the regime, mostly kind of middle class, upper middle class people, they said that one of the reasons they're supportive of the regime, they said, listen, we don't love the regime. Like, there's a lot of things wrong with them. All of our politicians are corrupt. We don't trust them, but at least it's better than the unknown. And, for someone who is, especially for someone who's like middle class, upper middle class, they have a house, they have a bit of savings, they have kids that they want to put through college, or, they want to be able to kind of make it to being able to retire. That idea of like the unknown, of some sort of huge change that could, often regime change or governments change in very violent ways. And often there's a period of a lot of unrest People sometimes lose. I know people in Afghanistan when there was change there that lost their entire life savings. So, people were very nervous about that. And I think that I would imagine that those concerns persist to this day, that the fact that Israel launched a war on Iran doesn't necessarily change that calculation of, what's like the less dangerous option for my family.
And that's not a hypothetical for these
Mm,
families, right? I mean,
exactly.
we're on the tail end of the Arab Spring, 13 years of civil war in Syria, and regime change in Iraq, and defying the US directives in Iraq certainly didn't bring the people safety and security. Um, so clearly there are examples coming to play here, but I want to shift back to the questions. There's a really interesting one. Iran always says the nuclear program is for peaceful purposes for the generation of fuel. And the question here is, does the movement away from fossil fuels in the region have any role to play here? I mean, is nuclear power becoming something that people say they're pursuing nuclear power because they want to get a weapon, but is nuclear power becoming part of the discussion?
Well, I mean, there's definitely a lot of interest in that from countries like Saudi Arabia that are trying to chart their move away from dependence on oil, and that's why you saw a lot of interest from the region in this kind of consortium nuclear enrichment idea. It was one of the ideas that was floated that would have kind of solved the Iran enrichment issue, where the nuclear material would have been moved outside of Iran to, say, Saudi Arabia or the UAE, and it would have been enriched there. And there was a lot of interest in that. And presumably, part of that interest is because there is a wider interest in nuclear power in the region. It's a region where even as they're building their economies in ways to try to pull the countries away from dependence on fossil fuels, they are still going to have a big dependence on energy. These are countries that are not livable without air conditioning in the summer. So if you want people to come and live in these places, you're going to have a lot of electricity for that. And now with this boom in data centers, fueled in part by this explosion in AI and tech, data centers require a lot of power, and they're being built in countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE because they have an abundance of power now. But there's definitely some people who are thinking, okay, like how can we start to partially build some of this on other sources of power, not just oil?
That's it. That's interesting. There's an important question that came in while we were talking about this. Um, Iran is not just a Shia Muslim country. There are a lot of minorities, Kurdish minority, and there's a question here about um, persecution on these minorities after the attack. This one is
Yeah.
particularly about hearing about more Baha'i being arrested. I also know that there were these stories about Israelis making phone calls and demanding things. I know that the regime has escalated executions again.
Mhm.
It, remark on this persecution. Has it become more intense?
Yeah, we saw a very swift crackdown by the regime against people all over the country, even as the war was still ongoing, even as the Israeli attacks were still ongoing. Arrests spiked in a lot of places. And it wasn't just arrests. I mean, arrests were the most concerning thing to a lot of people, but in a lot of places, definitely in Tehran, in some neighborhoods in Tehran, it was a larger police force on the street. More checkpoints. As people were fleeing the city for safety, they told us that there were more checkpoints on the roads checking the cars that were fleeing. And this is something that we've seen in Iran before, after the killing of the Hamas leader in Tehran last summer. We saw a pretty swift crackdown following that. Kind of, it was the way it was described in state media. It was rooting out, alleged, I don't even know if they used the word alleged, but they said, Israeli spies who had some connection to that assassination. And this is done in for multiple reasons, and one of it is to project. I mean, to us, it might sound very scary, this kind of a crackdown, but in a large part, this is done to project power. To remind people. That's why those checkpoints are set up. That's why more police or security are sent to the streets. It's to tell people, listen, like we're still here, we're still in charge, and there is a desire that this have a kind of a calming effect on some people. I mean, I guess it would be more calming than if all the security forces just vanished. That would definitely be much more concerning. But also, it's also these crackdowns are used to kind of round up the usual suspects and sweep up people that maybe they had the regime or the person who is in charge of security for that part of the country, someone that maybe they had wanted to arrest for a while and hadn't had the chance, that they would definitely be swept up in this kind of a crackdown. So we're seeing people who were involved in activism being taken up, and also the targeting of minority groups, like you mentioned.
Another question up here reminds us that Iran doesn't just look west, it also looks north and east, and that it, has their challenges on all of its border. The question here is, to what extent will the agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia affect the positions of the Iranian regime? And we could extend that to sort of ask also about how sort of the Taliban almost becoming normalized, what impact is that possibly having on the Iranian regime and how they view their position in the region.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen comments from Iran, not happy about this agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I think the element of this agreement that has frustrated Tehran the most is the granting the U.S. rights to this corridor of territory, and then also on top of that, naming it after President Trump, is definitely not has not like cooled tensions. It's definitely frustrated Iran. So no, we've already seen that. I don't know if this is going to be something that is creates a persistent issue or kind of evolves into a persistent issue. But I think the fact that Armenia and Azerbaijan were willing to enter into this agreement with that the United States mediated or brokered, it's a reflection of Iran's diminished position in the region. I think that that's the main kind of takeaway from this. And I think that, and again, like we've seen Iran issue some statements about this, but nothing more. And so I think that that also emphasizes that.
So, with Iran's diminished position, there's another question here about, wanting a little more thought on the Abraham Accords. How long might it take for other countries to do that? And also, if we think about Iran's diminished position, perhaps there's an opening there for negotiations. And our good friend Zeke Williams is asking about my favorite country in the Middle East, which is Oman, and their role in future diplomatic negotiations with Iran.
Yeah, I mean, Oman, they hosted many of the talks between the U.S. and Iran for the nuclear negotiations. I think and by hosting these talks, they definitely have ingratiated themselves. The Trump administration proved once again that they are an important country in the region whose power kind of extends regionally, not just within their own borders. So that was definitely a win for Oman. Iran trusts Oman more than any of the other countries in the region. Don't expect that to change in any way. It could be, we could, if some sort of a diplomatic process starts up again, I wouldn't be surprised if Oman again plays hosts to the negotiations.
Well, thank you, Susanna. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your insights with us. And I admire your ability to really capture that nuance all the way up from, Iranian elite officials, leaders in the Gulf states, right down to people in the street. So thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Your questions were so interesting, and I'm very happy to do it. Maine has a very special place in my heart. My family and I, we used to go to Bailey Island in the summers. And so, yeah, it was when I received the invitation, I was more than happy to do it. So, thank you.
Well, I'm delighted, and a big thank you to our board member Zeke Williams, who made the connection and invited you. I think we've all enjoyed this conversation. Again, thank you to C-SPAN for broadcasting this on their channel. I do apologize for the technical difficulties. The World Affairs Council of Maine is a teeny organization, but we have a big impact in Maine and beyond in terms of promoting awareness of world events and global understanding. And we are able to do that because of you, our members, who are so generous with your support, and also our wonderful sponsors. I read out this beautiful tribute to you at the beginning, which I guess nobody heard, but big thanks to Coffee by Design, Flight New Media, Thomas Mosier, American Furniture, and our partner, the University of Southern Maine. We are working on a fourth webinar in this series. We are working to actually get the Iranian perspective. So stay tuned for that. And our first speaker program of the fall season will begin on September 17th with a book talk given by former U.S. Ambassador Frank Lavin on what lessons can we learn from the foreign policy of the Reagan administration today. So again, thank you to Susannah, thank you to our members and sponsors and everyone, and I wish you all a wonderful evening. Good night.